For the first time in 50 years, the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank are being relocated. Originally held in Washington, D.C., New York, Paris, and other European countries, these annual meetings are now resonating in the African continent, exactly in Marrakesh, the beautiful city in Morocco. These assemblies provide an opportunity to review some of the commitments made by political leaders and financial decision makers to set clear deadlines for long-term structural reforms to make the new global financial pact a reality. Before the important political signal of relocating these meetings to the African continent, these gatherings also serve as a platform to discuss how the international financial institutions will respond to the high expectations of the most vulnerable countries in the world in terms of economic progress and development. They also anticipate another important deadlines to come between now and the end of the year of 2023 to make progress on reforms that go beyond the banks and affect the structure of the international financial system. To deep dive into the components of this new global financial architecture, I am honored to host Dr. Marc Uzan, who is a renowned expert in the field of international finance and economic governance, who has been also a driving force between initiatives that support the global economic governance. Dr. Marc Uzan, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you to you.
First of all, to deep dive into our discussion, I would like to have your current insights about the current global economic governance. What do you think about it?
Well, thank you first. It's a great pleasure to be in Marrakesh. And as you said, it's the first time that the annual meeting of the World Bank and the IMF is taking place in the African continent. And this meeting is taking place at a critical moment where for the first time since, I believe, 1994, when you have a major commission to reform global economic governance, that you are seeing some new momentum about adapting the Bretton Woods institutions for new circumstances and for new missions. Of course, this comes at a time where you have major crises around the world, what Adam Tooze called polycrises. We went from pandemic, war, and also concern about geopolitical forces, and clearly the US-China decoupling and potential de-risking. So despite all of this, there is clearly some momentum to think about how can we adapt not only the World Bank but the IMF toward new missions. And for the last, I would say 12 months, there was among some G20 leaders willingness to reform first the mission of the World Bank, to provide more capital for the World Bank, but also at the same time to do the same thing for the International Monetary Fund. So before we go into details about what is at stake for global economic governance, let's try to look at the state of the global economy, because that will address also where do we see the IMF and the World Bank are going to lead us. We are seeing, a major change in the economic landscape at the global level. We have been willing and we have been dealing for the last decade for a time where we have low inflation, low interest rate, to a time where the macroeconomic paradigm is changing toward higher inflation and higher interest rate. That will change completely the macroeconomic policy landscape, not only for advanced countries, but also for emerging markets. That's number one, that this is the background. So what do we want to reform, and what reform are so important? First, it's all about, some time we forgot, it's about inclusiveness. If you look back for the last 75 years, the governance of the IMF, the World Bank, hasn't really changed, and the global economic is changing. The drivers of global growth is not driven by advanced countries, it's driven by emerging markets. Number two, if you look at the state of demographic, Africa, where we are today, is as a core. And we have not really addressed, the representation of these countries in global economic governance. Two, the mission was all about macroeconomic stability for the IMF and the World Bank fighting poverty. But now we have new global challenges like climate. So I believe that this Marrakesh event come at a time where for the last, I would say 12 months, you have had some important international meeting, one that took place a couple of months ago in Paris, called the Global Finance Summit. In 3 months, you are going to have the COP28. And now we are in Marrakesh as the middle. And I'm strongly a believer that there will be some important decisions that are going to be made for the first time about adapting the international financial institutions for new circumstances. So what is going to be, I will say, the main changes that can affect the IMF and the World Bank and can be in decision that can be made here in Marrakesh? Number one is, I believe, some consensus about providing and defining the mission of the World Bank. It's not going to be just about fighting poverty, but it's going to be also fighting climate change. And this is going to have major implications about the mission of the World Bank. For many years, we talk about the IMF not just as, guardian of macroeconomic stability, but capacity to fight financial crises. If you look back over the last 30 years, we have had many crises in emerging markets, and we have the global financial crisis. But at the same time, the capacity for the IMF to have enough resources to fight this financial crisis were going down because all the new resources were not permanent. There was only, just I would say, on the sidelines, so government and countries were committed to provide some support to the IMF on an ad hoc basis. What we want now is to provide resources to the IMF that are becoming more permanent, meaning increasing the pools of resources that IMF can rely on to deal with any type of financial crisis happening around the world. So number one, either from the World Bank, clearly a change of mission to make sure that not only fighting poverty, but also fighting climate will be part of the DNA of the World Bank. And for the IMF, to make sure there is a consensus to have resources that are permanent, not ad hoc basis. So that will say that's going to be the first priority, and maybe Marrakesh can hopefully come up with this outcome. Number two, which is going to be more challenging, when you change the governance of the IMF, you are going to try to make sure that you change also the representation. China in 1970 weight in the global economy was very tiny. China today represents the size of the global economy in the 1990s. But China's share at the IMF is less than 4%. It should be almost 14%. The problem is that it's going to be very difficult to reach a consensus due to the fact that you have this US-China conflict to agree to give China the right share at the IMF, so to be the second largest shareholders after the United States. So you are going to have maybe a compromise that all member countries will agree to increase the resources of the IMF, but at the same time to say, well, in terms of looking at the shareholders, let's think about the formula, let's think about the way we weight economies at the IMF to decide about increasing, the representation of China in the IMF. So I will argue that what I can expect from in Marrakesh will be clearly an increase of capital for the World Bank, an increase of resources for the IMF, but unfortunately, no change of the weight of the governance, where US will still be the largest shareholders, but no change about the weight of China within the IMF. And we can discuss afterwards what might be the consequences of this compromise.
Okay, but what about Africa's role in this global economic governance? Considering experience, how do you view the potential of the role of the African nations in shaping this global economic governance reforms?
Africa. So if you look back, there is clearly an awareness, and unfortunately it comes because we have the Ukrainian conflict, that we have now what I will call the North and the South. We used to call emerging markets. This is why in the 1990s there was a creation of the G20, because we realized that many emerging markets were becoming more important in terms of driving the global growth. And there is this new awareness now that we bring all these countries, the global South, together as it was. They have a common perspective and a common view about the reform of global governance. But for the first time, when you have an agreement in September that the African Union will be entering the G20, is a strong signal that will have major ramifications and major consequences that we have to take Africa, not only as part of the international community, but they are going to shape the global economy in the next 3 decades, in terms of demographic, in terms of energy. And I believe you see for the first time here in Marrakesh, so many events, so many seminars where we want to hear the voice of Africa. It's not just about Morocco, it's about many other African countries, and I believe that Morocco can play a role to drive what I will call this global South. Africa's voice is going to be heard, not only due to the weight of the continent, to the view of demographic, because there is, I think, more and more capacity for this continent, not only to grow, but also to have and to build a sustainable and inclusive growth. So maybe Marrakesh will be looked back in history of the IMF and World Bank as the first time where the African voice is not just, I would say, a given, but they're going to be now an agent for change for the IMF and the World Bank, but more for the global financial architecture. The Paris summit in June was already a good sign, where you have many African countries who play an important role to shape the agenda. Marrakesh will be, I believe, another moment where you can hear the African voice, but also is what are going to be the proposal to reform global finance and the international financial institution, either the World Bank, but more than that, the multilateral development banks. But I believe, the feeling about a world that is just driven by the advanced countries is over. You see, with the fault line with the Ukraine conflict, that you cannot just, divide the world between the North and the South. It's not the center and the periphery anymore. It's more complex. So I believe we are going to be in a world where you are going to have alliances, but I am a believer that there will be a consensus for building a global public good. Global challenge can just be managed by global public institutions. And if the IMF and World Bank will have a new chapter in their existence, that, the idea of having an IMF managing director from Europe and head of the World Bank from the US should be over, and that we should have an open and transparent process to select the next managing director of the fund that can come from Africa, from any other emerging market.
Okay. You have mentioned already that climate change is a very pressing issue, and now it's taken a very great importance in this new financial architecture. When it comes to climate and economic governance, given the growing importance of climate issues, how do you see climate governance intersecting with economic governance at the global level?
Well, the question here is indeed, are we going to forget, the fight toward poverty by just thinking about and providing resources to emerging countries and developing countries toward climate change and mitigation? So this is a challenge, Are we going to tell the World Bank now, your main mission is also about providing resources to developing countries toward mitigation and toward net zero economy, forgetting, the other mission, which is about fighting poverty. So this is an important trade-off, and this is going to be, I think, as a center of the conversation. Can we say to this country, well, you cannot, grow because now the only way is to reduce, emission at a global level. So I think this is going to be the way how we are going to find the intersections between these two missions. And I think here also the commitment from advanced country to developing countries, is so huge, so needed, that we know that the World Bank will be an important player with other MDBs, but we need the private sector. We need to make sure that private investors can come in with the World Bank in these countries in terms of financing infrastructure, connectivity between North Africa and Europe. But in order to do that, investors, they want returns, they want transparency, and they want to make sure that risk is reduced. So there is maybe potential here to find a way to de-risk, famous de-risking, either foreign exchange risks or other risks, where investors will be willing to commit resources to invest in developing countries.
Okay. I want to move on right now to how can we promote inclusivity in economic governance, and how can global economic governance institutions ensure greater inclusivity and representation from diverse ocean stakeholders, but also are there mechanisms in place to engage civil society and emerging economies in the decision-making process?
So when we look back at what we discussed at the beginning of this conversation, we look at the state of global economic governance, that despite the gloomy state of affairs where the international order is being questioned, when you see a rise of fragmentation in the global economy, where you see that what we talked about was global economic integrations, and now when you meet in Marrakesh, the key was is also about how can we disintegrate from China, for example? How can we reduce risk and reduce dependencies? So what used to be a consensus about the paradigm that was globalization, we are meeting here where the discussion is going to be how I can de-risk, or I can decouple, or I can find a way to reduce my dependencies. It's all about statecraft, it's all about genomics. That's the background number one. So how can you preserve and how can you build your machinery of international cooperation where the world is upside down, where everyone is testing the international order, when you see a type of parallel governance happening in the global economy, You have the old institution that we discussed and willingness to reform, like the IMF and the World Bank. But at the same time, you have a major frustration from the South. This is the reason why China, the next second largest economy in the world, decided at the same time to build a second best solution. And the second best solution was to build a set of institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the BRICS, and the Belt and Road Initiative Forum. They were, I believe, institutions to try to think that there is maybe an alternative to the current international economic order. And that has been attracting. People ask the question, why so many countries want to join the BRICS? And if you look at the BRICS as country, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa as the founding members, if you ask me, what do they have in common? The only thing they have in common was they always wanted to question the hegemony of the US dollar. Because these countries are very diverse, but they didn't have something to say, okay, we're going to drive an alternative international economic order. But for the last few weeks and the last few months, you saw at the last meeting that many countries from the South want to be joined as a member. So is a world that we are going to go in the next decade, and I think that's why Marrakesh is so important.
Absolutely.
Is it going to be about willingness to reform the World Bank and the IMF, not only to provide more resources to the institution, but to accept that the world is very diverse, to accept that there is a vision of the South among reforming the global governance, or are we going to have a fragmented and a fractured global governance? So we need to monitor these two parallel tracks. What we used to call the historical institutions that were built after World War II, and we have to remember they were built during a time where the world was very fragmented because it was the end of World War II. Or are we going to see that China being frustrated by not perceived that they are the second largest global economy in the world, that the US is blocking China weight in the IMF and the World Bank, that China will go on its own, not only because they already built international institutions, but they want to attract the South. Come with me, I can provide funding, I can help you to become member of institutions, and you have, of course, already the Belt and Road Initiative that was been underway for the last few years, that has also created major headache for many countries in terms of debt indebtedness. So we need to monitor these two tracks, So global governance is in a state of flux, but this is for the first time since the last 30 years that you see a clear commitment from the Western countries, Europe and the US, who are starting to recognize that they cannot just monopolize, if you wish, the decision-making process, that they need the South. The South should be not only a bystander, but a real player to shape global economic governance, because the challenge we are facing are a global one. We are not going to fight climate change if you have only Europe going to neutrality, where the rest of the world doesn't pay attention. So it's all about inclusiveness, it's all about legitimacy, and it's all about providing signals that is not decision-making is not driven only by the advanced countries.
Dr. Marc Hezon, thank you very much for these great insights. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for following us. Thank you very much.